Welcome again to our church history classes, Christ's Church Through the Ages. We are now in lesson 6, which is the destruction of Jerusalem, part 2. In our last session, we covered part 1, which was kind of the introduction to what we call the Jewish Revolt, which is what kicks off this ordeal of the Jewish-Roman War, which runs from 66 to 73 AD, that 7-year period. The height of which, of course, is obviously that first kind of 3.5 years, that's 66 to the destruction and the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Let me just simply recap for us just some very, very brief details about what we covered in the last session, okay? Just very briefly. So the fighting between Greeks and Jews in Caesarea Maritima is what launched this kind of Jewish revolt. It's the pretext of which sparked this revolt in Judea. You had specifically a scenario where the Greeks were sacrificing unclean animals in front of one of the synagogues there in Caesarea Maritima. This brought about fighting, a number of people arrested, some died, I believe, of memory as well. In response to that, the kind of religious or political response to that were the prayers and sacrifices for the Roman emperor at the temple in Jerusalem were then halted in protest. In response to that action on the part of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership, Florus, governor from Rome, sent Roman troops in to plunder the temple, and he took about 17 talents worth of money, which approximates to about 770 kilos worth of gold, silver, etc., etc. This was under the guise of unpaid taxes, so some things never change. The Jews then ended up responding to that again, which is the bigger escalation. The Jews then kill a number of Roman soldiers and as well as unarmed citizens. Florus deploys the Roman army, Roman armed forces, who then raid Jerusalem in response. Following that raid, a number of the Jewish leaders were arrested in the city, and they were, again, a number of them tortured and crucified, even though many of them were Roman citizens, so it was completely illegal in that response on the part of the Romans by Roman law. In response to that act of violence, various Jewish factions, particularly the kind of nationalistic or hyper-nationalistic ones like the Zealots and the Sicarii, who we talk about a bit more, not today, but when we get on to the next lesson, they then launch an armed insurrection. From that point, many Roman military garrisons are overrun, many Roman soldiers slaughtered, even though many of them had surrendered. There are Roman citizens that are then butchered in the streets, and kind of it's on for young and old, so to speak. This launches a kind of Jewish campaign to cleanse Judea of any and all Gentiles, Caesarea Maritima, Jerusalem, kind of all around the traps. And so that's the basic explanation of the backdrop of what we had in the last lesson, okay? And so what we're wanting to focus on this morning, this afternoon I should say, is the kind of, and I say this loosely, the first half of the Jewish-Roman War, not in terms of literal time, but in terms of its major categories. The Jewish-Roman War can really kind of be broken down into 2 categories: the campaign of Cestius Gallus, or who are just called Gallus, and then the later campaign of Vespasian. For those who know Roman history, they'll recognize that name. Vespasian would go on to become emperor of Rome from 69, or late 69 through to 79 AD for 10 years there. But here is the kind of first major action or campaign of that war, which was commanded and led by Cestius Gallus. So we'll be focusing here. Again, I'll just refer to him as Gallus for simplicity's sake. So, as a result of the Jewish revolt itself, right, the Emperor Nero then commands Cestius Gallus, who was the legate, which is to say the governor, of the Roman province of Syria. Right, so north of Judea, the Roman province of Syria, covered not only a big portion of what is today the nation state of Syria, but also across into what today is Lebanon as well. So a lot of the coastal areas, cities like Acre, Tyre, Sidon, the Phoenician, Canaanite city-states, that was all Syria and to the north of Judea. So he commands the governor, the legate of the neighbouring province, Syria, to then march down the 13th Legion, which was stationed in Syria, upon Judea, right, to restore order. Right, they were known as the 13th Legion, the 12th Legion, I should say, sorry. The nickname Fulminata. All the different Roman legions had nicknames to them, so to speak, epithets. Fulminata means lightning, or the thunderbolt more specifically, so the Thunderbolt Legion. A strong legion, but again, it's only one legion. A legion is different sizes at different times. For simplicity's sake, at this point, a legion was about 5,500 troops roughly, but we're happy to round it to about 6,000. It wasn't quite 6,000 yet, but for simplicity's sake, 5,000 to 6,000 troops was one legion. Okay, Rome had many, many legions. About 20. I want to say about 20-ish, 20 to 25 probably at this point in the first century. Those numbers would greatly increase over the coming centuries, to the point where I think Rome had, nearly 60 legions at one point under Constantine. But anyway, they marched down from Syria into Judea. Okay, they were combined with other kind of sub-units or select units from the 3rd, the 4th, and the 6th legions as well. So not whole 6,000, but a cohort, which is about 500 troops. They were combined with from those other units as well, those other legions, as well as auxiliaries and allies. Long story short, this is a total force of what we think is about 30 to 35,000 troops. So the basic unit of the 12th Legion, so 6,000 troops roughly, 5,000 to 6,000, plus other select units from the 3rd, the 4th and the 6th Legions, and then their allies and auxiliaries, which would always usually be the exact same amount of troops as whatever Rome had. So basically you could usually take the Roman numbers, and I'm just using a round figure, if Rome had 10,000 troops, they would have another 10,000 auxiliaries or allies, right? So auxiliaries, we've explained this before, but auxiliaries were, roughly speaking, native troops that had been conquered and then kind of amalgamated into the overall superstructure of the Roman army. Okay, it's a considerable force. It's not as gargantuan as what Vespasian's going to hail down upon them in a couple of years. But we'll get to that in the next lesson. But 30 to 35,000 troops. They didn't just send in, a couple of hundred. They didn't just send in a cohort to, kind of police things. They sent in a legitimate military response of a solid number, even by Roman standards. 30 to 35,000 troops down from Syria. And they launched their invasion of Judea with the specific goal of restoring order in the neighbouring province, is essentially how we think of it. Right? The goal here was that this is, and this was the perception at this point, this is a revolt in a backwater province on the far outskirts of the empire that we just simply need to quell, like we've done 100 times before. Right? The Roman army was continually putting out spot fires from their perspective, and this was just another one. So they were sending down the neighbouring governor and one legion plus attachments from other legions to restore order. That's the Roman perspective. The reason why I'm pointing that out is because it puts in light what comes at the end of this lesson, and more importantly, what's going to come down the pipeline in the next lesson, which is the response under Vespasian. This will really put it in perspective. By the time we get to the end of the day, you'll see why that little insight into Rome's perspective becomes important, especially as we then see this event unfold before us. One thing which will be helpful is, and you've got it there on page 3 of your notes, right? Figure 1, the territorial map of the Jewish-Roman war. This is a useful guide for this week, obviously, and the coming lesson as well. I'll include it in the other notes as well, but just so you have a copy there. This gives you a decent rough breakdown of the territorial changes as the war goes on. To help you understand what we're looking at, let me just explain it for a moment. So hopefully you can distinguish, when you go up to the north of that map, you can hopefully distinguish, see where Batanea is. You can hopefully distinguish between the kind of light red and the dark red sections. Yep. Areas like Caesarea Philippi up there is in that northern city is a good area to explain where the difference is, the light red and the dark red. You've then also got different shades of blue that I've tried to encapsulate as best as I can here. You've got these lighter shades of blue like Galilee, for example, right? Other territories down in the southwest like Ashdod and Lod and Ashkelon. These are many names which you're probably familiar with from the Old Testament. You've then got a kind of true blue, like a royal blue kind of colour, but like is Idumea down there in the south. And then if you look at Judea, which is where Jerusalem is, it's then like the darkest blue. Okay? What this is showing you is differences between the Judean territories during the war that they held, that's the blue, and then the Roman ones are the red. What you have to see here, and I'm going to try and hopefully point this out as best as I can for you, so pay attention. All the blue sections, various shades, plus the dark red section, not light, dark red section, combine all those together, so in other words, everything that's not light red, that's the original province of Judea. Okay? So that's the whole province. Everything not in light red. The light red is the province of Syria. So that's where they're marching down from. Does that make sense? Yep. And what you end up having as the war breaks out, and you can see there's a little key there, a legend in the bottom right corner that shows you the colour breakdowns and the different time periods, 60 to 67, 67 to 68, 68 to 70, etc. And then obviously the dark red is Roman Judea, so that's the broader context of the whole province of the dark red plus all the blues, okay? And so it's showing you, you can kind of obviously, as you pitch your way forward through this legend, all of the blues is what they held when they first revolted. So they had Galilee, and they had the territory across the Sea of Galilee in Gamala. They also had the territories down in Philistia, right, Ashdod, Lod, Jaffa, Ashkelon, etc. And then as the war goes on, you can see their territories shrink and shrink and shrink, to the point where by the time you get to the fall of Jerusalem, they're holding Jerusalem and some territories around it, kind of Bethlehem and other areas around like Judea proper, okay, as the Romans advance. So that's a useful enough guide to try and understand the territorial holds. So when this breaks out, the revolt happens, they drive out the Romans, and now the Romans have to invade from Syria from the north. They hold the Jews, the Judeans, hold places like Galilee up in the north. Okay, does that make sense? Beyond Samaria. Keep that in mind as we're referring to places as we work our way through this, okay? So, working our way, keep going through the notes in this campaign of Gallus. The Roman forces, when they cross the border from Syria in the north, they capture a number of those Galilean cities quite quickly. A number of them, in fact most of them, surrendered without a fight, so they surrendered immediately. Of the limited Jewish forces that decided to fight, they were very, very quickly defeated in the regions of Galilee. And so the Romans take over Galilee very, very quickly, about as quickly as the Americans did Iraq. Moving forward from there, the Roman forces then march south along the coastline down to Caesarea Maritima. Again, we've pointed out before, especially in our Bible study on the book of Acts, Caesarea, obviously Jerusalem's the biggest city, the most important city, but it wasn't the capital of the province of Judea, okay? The Roman capital was Caesarea Maritima. So that was an important strategic goal for them, to capture Caesarea Maritima, right? It's where Pontius Pilate's palace was in the days of his primary residence, in the days of Jesus, obviously, as well as all the other successive proconsuls and governors and such. They move forward from Caesarea, take that over, they reconquer Caesarea Maritima, down what's called the Sharon Plain, down to Jaffa, right? So Jaffa, Jaffa, as you would say in the Hebrew. That's called the Sharon Plain. They conquer all that territory between there, again, relatively quickly, relatively speaking. An important strategic place. Jaffa, we've come across in our Bible study in the book of Acts. Jaffa is very important. Caesarea Maritima is as important as it gets in this part of the world, certainly from the political perspective. And so they go very hard in their warfare there. They kill, as far as we can tell, about nearly 8,500 civilians between those two cities die kind of as collateral damage, as the Roman forces kind of work their way down, conquering those territories between Caesarea Maritima and Jaffa as well. From that point, having kind of very swiftly moved their way south, again by relative standards, they then eventually come to obviously Jerusalem, which is a big target for them, the biggest target. They've secured Galilee, they have secured the Sharon Plain, right, Caesarea Maritima down to Jaffa, right, and other areas obviously throughout Samaria, and they now need to march upon Jerusalem. This is where the Sanhedrin, the Jewish leadership, were headquartered. It's where their campaign was being coordinated from strategically. And it's here where we start to come to the really important parts of everything we've been building up to in regards to this whole event of the destruction of Jerusalem, especially concerning the Christians. Okay. What the Romans do, having now marched upon Jerusalem, they then, what we call in military terminology, invest the city. Right, so not investment in an economic sense, but investment in military terms is talking about surrounding a city and preparing for a siege, right? So there's a number of things you do depending on obviously the technological capabilities of your time period, but in ancient and even medieval warfare, you surround the city, you build entrenchments, you build embankments, and your primary goal certainly initially is to cut off the city from the outside world. Okay, that's how a siege works. Sieges are designed to run for weeks and months, sometimes even years, depending on the size of the city. And this was determined not only in ancient times but medieval times by basically not only one factor, but primarily one factor. How much food did you have? Right? What kind of resources and supplies did you have? It was also determined by how big was your war chest. Right? Because warfare up until the last 100 to 200 years used to be a fairly simple equation. You would have a treasury, right, where your treasures were stored. That was your war chest, so to speak, and you kept fighting until it ran out. Plenty of wars have ended because one side just literally ran out of money. That's how warfare used to be done. It was a very good balance and check, and then we invented this thing. Well, we didn't invent. We revived in a brand new way this thing called fiat currency and the printing press, where we just infinitely print money and just continue to go war forever. Not a good nor moral move. But so they actually surround the city here, right? There are Christians who have left and fled. As far as we can tell from the accounts of not only Tacitus on the Roman side of the equation, as well as Josephus, the Jewish historian who was initially on the Jewish side and then defected to the Romans, but other church historians as well, like Eusebius, who's basically the most important early church historian. What we can tell is that the vast majority of the Church of Jerusalem was still in Jerusalem at this point. Okay, that's the way it seemed, right? Based on the historical record. And so they surround the city, they set up the investment, right, cutting off Jerusalem from the outside world. There's very standard tactics for preparation of a long siege. Now, keep in mind, Jerusalem's a major city that's fairly wealthy by relative standards. Not the wealthiest in the empire, but one of the wealthiest. Certainly on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, in the eastern parts of the world in the empire, it's one of the bigger cities and the wealthiest. They have, as far as we can tell, probably years' worth of resources. Right, this siege is not happening in a month. The Romans are almost certainly preparing to have a siege go on for potentially 12 to 24 months. That's a long time. They start making initial gains, but then something literally extraordinary happens. For reasons that are completely inexplicable, as far as any historian or military strategist can tell, the Romans just simply one day, under the orders of Gallus, decide to break the siege and retreat. Okay? They retreat west towards the coast, heading towards Jaffa. Why? We have no reason. There's no written record among the Romans as to why this decision was made. There's no writing that comes from Gallus explaining his decision. There's no explanation from Tacitus or Pliny or any of the other Roman historians, given almost even like a kind of post hoc way, trying to describe even like a political spin on why they did this. There's many military historians have tried to hypothesize as to ways in which this might, or reasons for which this would occur, and there's basically the resounding answer has just been a shrug of the shoulders. As far as we can tell, this just is completely inexplicable. It defies explanation and has very clearly left historians and particularly military historians, kind of baffled. They had the city surrounded. They had prepared their siege, and it even started to make like some initial gains. And then for absolutely no reason that we can tell whatsoever from the historical record, they abandon the siege and retreat. You'll see there in your notes that I've cross-referenced Luke chapter 21, and particularly a subsection of that, verses 20 to 24. This is Luke's accounting of the Olivet Discourse. Obviously, the Olivet Discourse is a very, very famous and important part of Christ's ministry. It's accounted in more detail, particularly in Matthew chapter 24. Okay, so the Olivet Discourse is where he's been in the temple complex. He's pronounced his curses and woes upon Jerusalem and upon the Pharisees and the scribes, right, the religious leaders. He then departs the temple, obviously, to the Mount of Olives, which is to the east, very clearly imaging the same kind of prophetic move that we see in Ezekiel 10, where the glory of God departs the temple to the east in judgment against Jerusalem. He then resides upon the Mount of Olives, which is exactly where the glory of God goes to the east, right, in Ezekiel. And he then gives this explanation of this great destruction that would befall Jerusalem. In Luke's accounting, the way that Luke records the wording is that in verse, I forget it's either 20 or 21 there, but it's in that subsection. When you see Jerusalem, he's speaking to the Christians of the first century, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that the abomination of its desolation is upon you. Right, it's at hand. And the command he then gives, to paraphrase, is to then flee to the hills in the east. Right, so flee Jerusalem to the east. He says, woe to any pregnant mothers upon that day, right, who get caught in Jerusalem. He tells them, he's obviously using very vivid language, he's speaking prophetically, of course, here. He says, and I'm paraphrasing, don't grab your belongings, don't worry about packing up the house. No, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, this judgment that I'm proclaiming upon it, this great and mighty destruction is about to befall. It's coming. You need to flee, right? And this is what we call, or what we refer to specifically as the flight to Pella. The flight to Pella. Pella is in the east, in Perea, across the Jordan River. Okay? And so what we get accounted to us is these very events. We get accounted for us in history. Josephus tells us about it. I think Tacitus does. Don't quote me on that. I think he does. Josephus 100% does. And we also then get that explained to us that indeed the Church of Jerusalem heeded the warning that Christ gave, from their perspective, nearly 40 years ago, to flee when they were seeing Jerusalem to be about to be surrounded by an army of the nations. And they flee Jerusalem to the east, and they cross the River Jordan into Pella to safety. And so the Christians do obey and heed the warning, this great prophetic warning that Christ gives in the Olivet Discourse about the coming judgment and destruction of Jerusalem upon those who crucified him and who rejected the Messiah. We have this accounted to us on the Christian side of the equation by Eusebius. He then writes to us and explains quite clearly the following. This is in his famous work, Church History, or Ecclesiastical History. Eusebius's work of church history was written in the 4th century, was the first major kind of full historical narrative accounting of the history of the church. Eusebius was, at least on paper, we consider him to be basically the first kind of proper church historian. And he was writing in the 4th century, so the 300s, the first codified version of a church history. Okay, it's a fascinating read. It's a very brilliant read. Did a lot of great work in it. But in this particular subsection, he writes about this, and he says, and you'll see it there on page 2, quote, "The people of the Church of Jerusalem were commanded by an oracle given by revelation before the war to those in the city who were worthy of it, to depart and dwell in one of the cities of Perea, which they called Pella. To it, those who believed on Christ travelled from Jerusalem, so that when holy men had altogether deserted the royal capital of the Jews and the whole land of Judea," and then he continues on with other various details, right? So they flee, and Eusebius is accounting what Josephus as well as an eyewitness accounted, which is the Church of Jerusalem listened to Christ's warning from the Olivet Discourse of the judgment that was going to befall the apostate Jews, right, those who rejected Christ. But the true Jews, the ones who do believe in Christ and who believe in him as Messiah, the Church of Jerusalem, he was then going to spare. Right? And so they fled because of that warning that was given. You can read that, and I encourage you to go read that in Luke chapter 21. It's particularly verses 20 to 24 is that subsection. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that the abomination of its desolation is upon you. Right? And so we actually have this accounted to us in history, which is fascinating. It's a wonderful testimony to the faithfulness of the Church of Jerusalem, among many things. Right? They heeded Christ's warning that was given decades and decades prior, that they'd probably been sitting and waiting and seeing the signs of the time, so to speak, right? They'd been hearing of, we referenced this in the last time, the wars and rumours of wars, all these things which had been building up in the eastern Mediterranean provinces as well as all around the empire as well. And they don't, when the time comes, that fateful moment of decision, they don't tarry. Right? They don't hang around. They don't go, oh, well, maybe, let's just see how this plays out, you know. No, they flee, right? And the reason why I argue, I'm not the only one, the church historians for going way back have argued the same point. But theologically, the explanation that I and we would give for why on earth, for absolutely no apparent reason, Gallus decides to withdraw the Roman soldiers is purely because of the divine providence of God. Right? A sovereign act of God. There's no logical, rational reason from a military, strategic or tactical perspective as to why he would have broken that siege off, because it's hard enough just to surround a city anyway. Like, you have to fight your way to get a city surrounded. You don't just waltz up on the place, right? And then he just decides to retreat. The explanation that we give is that this was a divine act of God, just a straight up act of God, in providentially, by his sovereignty, moving the heart and the mind of Gallus to do his will, which was to retreat, which gave a window and an opportunity for the Church of Jerusalem to escape. Right? I think that's an incredible testimony to the sovereignty of God and to the fulfillment of his word, that his promises are sure and they're true, and that his word, literally his word, the scriptures, can be relied upon. And fortunately, beyond, extra Christian sources, right, like Josephus account for this, as well as the church sources like Eusebius, testify to this historically, and that we can then draw from that as Christians coming down the pike later, thousands of years, as to the wonderful testimony that is. So, jumping back over to the campaign of Gallus, as those Roman forces withdrew, they withdrew to the west, as I mentioned, more like kind of northwest, but nonetheless, they head in the general direction of the coastline, particularly Jaffa. In that retreat, or in that withdrawal to be more specific militarily, they're then ambushed by Judean forces, by a heavy Judean force, at what we call the Battle of Beth Horon. Okay, this occurs in obviously 66 AD. This is a famous battle not only in Judean history, but it is an infamous battle in Roman history. Beth Horon is mentioned Beth Horon comes up a number of times in the Old Testament. Beth Horon comes up in Joshua particularly. I think it might have actually featured in Deuteronomy, which we're obviously studying and going through expositorily in our liturgy. But it features a number of points throughout the Old Testament. After the Battle of Gibeon, which is sometimes colloquially known as the Battle of the Five Kings, where the Israelites conquer the army of 5 Canaanite kings, they then retreat back down heading towards the Philistine cities, which you can see there. Those are cities like Ashdod and Lod and Gath, which is where Goliath was from. They pass through Beth Horon, and they get slaughtered again by Joshua and the armed forces of the Israelites. Beth Horon, in this particular part of it, is a pass, right? So cliffs either side, and you go through a pass. Militarily, it's a very dangerous move, but it's the only real thoroughfare through that part of Judea/Samaria, that kind of in-between area. So the Romans retreat through this, whether or not they have the exact same local knowledge as the Judeans is probably what caused this. Again, keeping in mind, these guys are not stationed in Judea. These guys are stationed in Syria. okay, and other areas. So I dare say, and this is a hypothesis obviously, but we don't know, but I dare say this is an area of not knowing the local geography well enough to know that this is a choke point, and more importantly, if they don't know the history of the Old Testament, then they're not going to know about the fact that Canaanite armies got knocked for 6 by the Israelites in the Old Testament at Beth Horon, right? So they come through Beth Horon and they get ambushed. They're getting very tactically chased by the Judean forces, which you have to be careful. Again, there's a military saying, that you always need to be careful when chasing a retreating enemy, because you yourself might fall into an ambush, which happens many times. The very basic military move where you retreat and you then bring them into a section and then you flank them with a pincer maneuver and you then destroy them. Here, though, the Judeans are the ones who had set up the ambush because they had their forces at Beth Horon pincer the Roman forces, and it brought on an absolute massacre. This was a decisive Judean victory, with the Roman army trapped in the pass at Beth Horon, where they were then overwhelmed by their enemy. In the disarray, and this is an important part, in the disarray and the confusion, because they lose their military structure very, very quickly, and now they're even worse because the Roman army functions on structure. The reason why it was so powerful was the utilisation of military formations and everything else, and they've lost that now. And so what we have is an army in disarray, in enemy territory, trapped in a pass. In the midst of all that chaos and confusion, they end up losing the Roman Aquila. I'll mention more about this in a little bit. So keep a finger on that concept of them losing the Aquila, and why it's important and why it's significant. But the Aquila of the 12th Legion was lost and captured by Judean troops. And in the end, by the end of that battle, 6,000 troops had died from the Roman side. So in other words, an entire legion, not the whole 12th Legion, but a legion's worth of troops had died, much of which were from the 12th Legion, and many, many more wounded. They had about 20,000 troops at the battle, I think, roughly speaking. So it was a significant loss on their part. Okay. What then ends up happening is Gallus kind of barely escapes back to Syria. He takes with him a small guard, basically, and the only way he even manages to escape back into Syria is by basically sacrificing a number of his troops along the way, who basically died trying to protect him on the way back to Syria as he flees back out of Judea. Following this massive victory at Beth Horon, the Judean forces then establish a new government in the province of Judea, called which we just referred to as the Judean provincial government, and this was under the specific leadership of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Okay, obviously, you're familiar with those two groups from the scriptures, particularly, and they're going to be contrasted heavily with what comes later. Okay, under Vespasian and the many infightings and almost civil war that this Judean provincial government gets itself into in a couple of years' time. It lasts from 66 to 68, so you can see it only lasts 2 and a bit years, basically, before we then get on to what we'll look at in the next lesson particularly. So this defeat, as I'm sure you can probably well imagine, just the shock of this completely reverberates all around the empire. Technically even beyond the empire, even beyond the outskirts of the empire. Again, keeping in mind Rome has conquered the world effectively as far as everyone's concerned. They've conquered the oikumene, the inhabited world, but you still have these outskirts, these backwaters beyond them, like Germania up in Europe. The Germanic barbarians, as they called them, were never conquered by Rome, but even those places almost certainly would have heard of this, but this just sent shockwaves all around the empire. This was such a disastrous loss after what had been a relatively successful campaign, because on paper that Roman force should not have had a great difficulty dealing with those Judeans. The Judeans were not outnumbered at all. The Judeans had tens of thousands of troops. So it wasn't a numbers issue, but the Roman military was just simply far more far better trained and far better equipped. But to get absolutely routed in the technical military sense by the Judeans at Beth Horon, and then basically to have to do a completely uncoordinated retreat out of the entire province, was just so shockingly disastrous for not only Gallus, as I'm sure you can imagine, not only for the 12th Legion, much of which had been annihilated by this point, but also politically speaking, this was something which had massive, massive consequences. That's going to become really important when we look at what happens next week, and particularly in understanding the dynamic of this destruction of Jerusalem, which was prophesied by Christ. This judgment which was going to befall them, the generation which crucified the Messiah. It was the first time, you can see that in your notes, it was the first time since the infamous Battle of Teutoburg Forest, which occurred in the latter years of the reign of Augustus, the first emperor, second emperor, in AD 9. This was up in Germania, right? So Europe, northern Europe, against the Germanic pagans, who Rome was obviously trying to conquer. They crossed the Rhine, the famous German river, and encountered, in this particular case, not for the first time, the Germans, but they encountered them famously or infamously at Teutoburg Forest in Germania, okay? And in that was one of Rome, if not Rome's absolute worst loss, where 3 entire legions were annihilated. They basically went into that battle with 20,000 troops, and 20,000 troops never came out. The reason why that was so infamous, other than the fact that the entire Roman force, other than like a very, very small group, were annihilated, was because the 3 legions involved in that battle lost their Aquila. Now, what's the Aquila? The Aquila, and you'll see that in your notes, is the battle standard of the Roman infantry. Right, so Aquila is the Latin word for eagle, okay? And so the battle standard of the Roman infantry, not the whole army, but the infantry, right, the light infantry, the foot soldiers, was the golden eagle, right, the eagle of Rome, okay, the Aquila. And it was carried by an aquilopher, which was the one guy responsible for just carrying the battle standard. That was his job, right? It was a symbol of the authority, certainly at this point, it was a symbol of the authority of the emperor, it was a symbol of the authority of the Senate, and it was the proverbial idol, so to speak, of the glory of all that was Rome, okay? To lose that to the enemy was literally as bad as it gets. At Teutoburg Forest, for example, where they lost 20,000 troops in one battle, 3 legions wiped off the face of the earth. If they had have kept the Aquilas, it wouldn't have been as bad a loss. Losing 20,000 troops was far less important than losing the Roman Aquila. Okay? This is the first time that this had happened since AD 9. Right, so it's been 60 years by this point. And so them losing the Roman Aquila to the Judean forces was so shockingly disastrous. For starters, everyone involved in this loss is going to die. Okay, this happens in 66. Gallus dies by unknown causes, I think, a year later. We're not sure how he died. The historical record probably seems to point to him having committed suicide out of the utter shame of his disastrous campaign. That's what's most likely occurring. But they lose the Roman Aquila. This also becomes important, again, not just because I'm pointing out historical tidbits, it's because what happens at the end of the destruction of Jerusalem really informs A, not just the history, but B, things that we even see in the Bible. Okay, so the Roman Aquila being lost to the Judeans comes back up later, particularly when Vespasian's son, Titus, who had been put in charge by Vespasian of the actual conquest of Jerusalem, what he does with the Roman Aquila, particularly when he marches it into the temple and into the Holy of Holies, becomes very important. Okay, so I'm not just pointing it out for history's sake. It actually has real kind of biblical consequences for things that go on here. Okay, this is a disastrous loss that can't be understated, right? And so to kind of broadly round up here this afternoon, what we find is that in the utter enragement that befell the Emperor Nero and that overcame him, he kind of realises that this is not just merely some revolt in a backwater province in the far outskirts of the empire. This is deadly serious, and total war is now what's going to be called for to not only crush this Jewish rebellion, but to reclaim the kind of glory of Rome particularly, and then restoring, this is the more political side, restoring the confidence across the empire. Because again, in a lot of this work that we've been doing in kind of the lead up to this in previous lessons, this was a very, very sketchy time, the first century, right? There were wars and things going on left, right and centre, skirmishes like this going on and revolts. You had major natural disasters going on. There was all kinds of political turmoil left, right and centre. You had emperors being killed and assassinated one after the other, even after short reigns. Massive political instability. It was a time of great turmoil where people thought that the empire was coming to an end and that the world was coming to an end. And so to restore after this, and this is humongous problem for Rome, and then puts into light the absolutely terrifying response that's then kind of coming down. Because what happens is the Emperor Nero and the Senate commensurately agree to appoint Vespasian, who's a very important general at this point, and who is the future emperor coming up in 69. Right, so Nero, he dies in 68. There's then what we call the year of the four emperors in the beginning of 69. I'll talk about more next lesson, where Rome goes through, basically, I'm rounding here, but Rome basically goes through 3 emperors in about 9 to 12 months before Vespasian takes the reins. Again, we'll come back to that, right? But he appoints Vespasian to take command of this campaign, and he gives him just complete plenary authority to absolutely bear down the whole wrath of Rome upon Jerusalem and Judea. That sets the stage very well for the more terrifying component of this war, which we'll look at in the next lesson, which will be the campaign of Vespasian, okay, where you're going to see the full might and wrath of Rome come down upon Jerusalem, right, which obviously has big implications for things that we read scripturally. Right, and again, the Roman Aquila thing will become very important as well, and you'll see how that ties in by the time we get to the next lesson as well. So that actually ends this afternoon, okay? This is the campaign of Gallus, which was an absolute dumpster fire on top of a train wreck in the middle of a burning forest, as I like to say, and sets the stage for the horrors that are going to come and that we're going to hear about next lesson. I will point out, by the way, just in brevity, and this shouldn't be, it almost should be self-evident, but I'll say it anyway. What we're going to see in the next lesson in the campaign of Vespasian will obviously naturally contain details that are not for the faint of heart. It's war, and I'm saying this because I know what happened. It's a horrific war, even by the standards of warfare. It's a horrific war. Okay, particularly the siege of Jerusalem and its eventual fall. Okay, so I'm just wanting to lightly, I know it's very vacuous of me, it's somewhat vague, but I'm just wanting to at least prepare you so when you walk in, understand that there are going to be details in there that are really important for you to understand, and they legitimately are, even like they're legitimately important for you to understand, but they're very real world, because that's the world we live in, is the kind of concept I'm getting across. Does that make sense? Okay, just be prepared for that. That's all. That's the end. They're in. So, are there any questions or anything else about what we've covered today with the campaign of Gallus?
They seem to kill so many, they stop to bury them?
Yeah, the answer is no, not really. The Romans, certainly on the Roman side of the equation, the Roman retreat back up into Syria was so hurried and so unorganised and so chaotic that you would have had just an entire highway of Roman bodies practically, because the only concern that they had at that point was, and by they I mean Gallus the governor, was get me out of Judea. That was the only goal, and he was willing to sacrifice as many Roman troops as it took to get him back to safety. Okay, that concept is going to get pumped full of steroids by the time we get to the next lesson, because the siege of Jerusalem is literally one of. I'm not trying to hyperbolize it. Like, we get. The fortunate thing about all this is we get an eyewitness account from Josephus, okay, who was there. Like, he accounted all this stuff, right? So it's not like we're coming centuries later. Like, we have proper primary evidence, right? Primary sources, and the death and carnage that comes during the siege of Jerusalem. It's one of the most horrific sieges ever, and your question will have an almost infinitely greater answer in the next lesson when it comes to the siege of Jerusalem. That's why I'm trying to prepare you for it. Look, obviously troops, generally speaking, throughout war have tried to make the effort to bury the dead, but a lot of times that's just not possible to do. So Judea was filled with plenty of bodies by this point. I mentioned earlier that even just in that portion of the campaign where the Romans were conquering the Sharon plain from Caesarea Maritima down to Jaffa, they killed 8,500 civilians just in collateral damage, right? That's nothing compared to the rest of the war, let alone what's coming. I don't want to put any spoilers, but take the number 8,400 and maybe multiply it by like a factor of 20. That's where we're heading to. So it's big. So, yes. Any other questions? That's right. No. We don't have. I'm not aware of any nation or any terrorist organisation or anything else that is actively crucifying people as a modus operandi. It happens. So you will occasionally get Islamic terrorist organisations like, particularly the more ruthless ones like ISIS or Al-Shabaab, Ansar al-Sharia, etc., which will occasionally crucify a Christian. Generally speaking, the Islamic terrorists tend to favour beheadings or other such deaths when they kill people. But occasionally crucifixion. But no, not as there's no standardised punishment of any nation state that has that on the books as an actual execution method, thank God. No. But yes, you will occasionally get, when it happened, it's really only Islamic terrorist organisations or other instances like that, sort of kind of when Christianity arrived in Japan, for example, about 500 years ago. A number of those missionaries were kind of an equivalent of crucified. But yes, it's not something that happens on the regular these days. It's only sporadically by Islamic terrorist groups mainly. Yeah. Any other questions? Very good. Alrighty. So yes, as I said, next week next lesson we will pick up in this part 3 basically, and we'll be focusing on the campaign of Vespasian. Depending on how much detail we get through, I would like to basically have rounded this off by the next lesson. Once I get into the nitty-gritty of the material, I may need to focus just the siege of Jerusalem into its own lesson, but I hopefully should be able to get it packed into one lesson for a normal time period, okay? So, alrighty, thank you very much.